The autumn wind carried dust across the vast Montana plains as 17-year-old Ayanna pressed herself against the cold rock face of the canyon wall. Her heart pounded so hard she feared the sound might give away her hiding place. Blood stained her torn buckskin dress, and scratches covered her arms from running through thorny bushes in the darkness. 3 days had passed since the attack on her village. The memory still burned in her mind like a fresh wound. She had been gathering berries near the river when the gunshots began. Smoke rose from the teepees as men on horseback rode through her people's peaceful camp. These were not soldiers in blue uniforms, but rough men with dirty faces and cruel eyes who took what they wanted and burned the rest. Her grandmother had pushed a small leather pouch into her hands before the old woman fell. "Find the white rancher with kind eyes," she had whispered. "Your grandfather once saved his life. He will remember." Those were the last words Ayanna heard from her family before she ran into the wilderness. Now she stood at the edge of a different world. Below her stretched a well-kept ranch with wooden buildings, fences, and cattle grazing peacefully in green pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney of a large house, and she could smell bread baking. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She had eaten nothing but wild roots and creek water since fleeing her village. A tall man with graying hair stepped out of the barn carrying a bucket of grain. His movements were slow and careful, like someone who had seen many seasons of hard work. This had to be the rancher her grandmother spoke of, though Ayanna could not remember meeting him before. Fear held her frozen to the rocky ledge. What if grandmother was wrong? What if this man would turn her away, or worse, hand her over to the same outlaws who destroyed her village? But the alternative was slowly starving in the wilderness, while those murderers roamed free. She watched the rancher for nearly an hour, studying his face and movements. When he petted an injured calf with gentle hands, something in her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Look for kindness," the old woman had said. "It shows in how a person treats helpless creatures." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ayanna knew she had to make her choice. The outlaws would not stop searching for survivors. They knew someone had escaped their attack, and they would want to finish what they started. Her legs shook as she climbed down from the rocks. Each step toward the ranch felt like walking toward either salvation or doom. The rancher had gone back inside his house, and warm yellow light glowed from the windows. She approached the front porch on silent feet, the way her father had taught her when hunting deer. But when she reached for the wooden door, her courage failed her. What words could possibly explain her situation? How could she make this stranger understand the danger that followed her? A dog barked somewhere behind the house. The sound made her jump, and she nearly ran back to the rocks. But then the front door opened, and the rancher stood there holding a lantern. His eyes were indeed kind, just as grandmother had promised, though they also held the wariness of a man who had lived through dangerous times. They stared at each other for a long moment. Ayanna's whole body trembled from cold, fear, and exhaustion. The rancher's gaze took in her torn clothing, the dried blood on her arms, and the desperate look in her dark eyes. "Please," she whispered in English, the words barely audible. "May I remain here until the outlaws pass?" The question came out exactly as she had practiced it during her long journey, though her voice shook with emotion. The rancher said nothing at first. His weathered face remained unreadable as he studied her. Ayanna's heart sank. Perhaps grandmother had been wrong after all. Perhaps this man felt no obligation to help a Lakota girl, even if her grandfather had once saved his life. But then she saw something change in his expression. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and he nodded slowly. Without speaking a single word, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter his home. The warmth that greeted her as she crossed the threshold was like a gentle embrace. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of stew filled the air. The rancher set his lantern on a wooden table and turned to face her properly. "You're Running Bear's granddaughter," he said quietly. It was not a question. "You have his eyes." Ayanna nodded, surprised that he recognized her family connection. She had been very young when grandfather died, and she barely remembered him mentioning any white friends. "My name is Thomas Crawford," the rancher continued. "Your grandfather saved my life during a blizzard 20 years ago. Found me half frozen and brought me to your village to heal." He paused, seeing the pain in her eyes. "What happened to your people?" The words came slowly at first, then faster as the dam of grief broke open. She told him about the attack, about the men who came at dawn with guns and torches. She described running through the night, hiding in caves, drinking muddy water from streams. She spoke of her grandmother's final words and the terrible silence that followed. Thomas listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Those men," he said finally. "They've been terrorizing ranches and settlements all along the territory. Sheriff's been hunting them for months, but they always stay one step ahead." He looked directly at her. "You were right to come here. They won't think to look for survivors at a white man's ranch." He prepared a plate of stew and fresh bread, setting it before her with a cup of hot coffee. As Ayanna ate her first real meal in days, Thomas moved to the window and peered out into the growing darkness. "They'll come here eventually," he said, his voice grim. "They hit every ranch in their path, looking for supplies and horses." He turned back to her. "But until they do, you're safe under this roof." That night, as Ayanna lay on a soft bed with clean blankets, she felt the first moment of peace since the attack. The rancher had given her sanctuary, just as her grandmother promised. But she also knew their troubles were far from over. The outlaws were still out there, and they would not rest until they had taken everything of value from this territory. The question was not if they would come to Thomas Crawford's ranch, but when, and what would happen to both of them when that day arrived. For 3 days, Ayanna remained hidden inside Thomas Crawford's ranch house while he went about his daily work. She helped with cooking and cleaning, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. The routine brought her some comfort, though she jumped at every unexpected sound. Thomas proved to be a man of few words but many kindnesses. He brought her clean clothes that had belonged to his late wife and showed her how to tend the small vegetable garden behind the house. In the evenings, they sat by the fireplace while he told stories of her grandfather's bravery and wisdom. "Running Bear once told me that courage isn't the absence of fear," Thomas said one night, watching the flames dance. "He said it's doing what's right even when you're terrified." He glanced at Ayanna, who was mending one of his shirts. "You showed that kind of courage when you came to my door." Ayanna looked up from her sewing. "I had no choice. My grandmother said you were an honorable man. Your grandmother was a wise woman. I remember her making the best willow bark tea I ever tasted when I was injured." Thomas poked at the fire with an iron rod. "She and your grandfather saved more than just my life that winter. They saved my soul." Before Ayanna could ask what he meant, a horse whinnied nervously in the barn. Both of them froze, listening to the night sounds outside. Thomas rose quietly and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "Rider coming up the valley," he whispered. "Stay back from the windows." Ayanna's blood ran cold. Had the outlaws found her at last? She moved away from the firelight and pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing like a frightened rabbit. Heavy footsteps approached the porch, followed by a firm knock on the door. Thomas checked his rifle before answering, though he held it out of sight behind the doorframe. "Evening, Crawford," called a familiar voice. "It's Sheriff Morrison." Thomas relaxed and opened the door wider. A middle-aged man with a star-shaped badge stepped inside, removing his hat and nodding politely when he noticed Ayanna. "Sheriff, Thomas said, closing the door behind him. "What brings you out here so late?" "Bad news, I'm afraid," Morrison replied, accepting a cup of coffee. "The Garrett gang hit the Patterson Ranch this afternoon. Burned the house, stole their horses, and shot old Patterson when he tried to stop them." He shook his head grimly. "They're moving this way, hitting every spread along the river." Ayanna's hands began to tremble. These were the same men who had destroyed her village and murdered her family. Now they were coming here, to the one place where she had felt safe. "How many men are we talking about?" Thomas asked. "7, maybe 8, all of them armed and dangerous." The sheriff noticed Ayanna's frightened expression and lowered his voice. "Miss, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas and Ayanna exchanged glances. They had agreed to keep her identity secret, but now she wondered if the sheriff might be able to help. "Sheriff," Thomas said carefully, "this young woman has information about the Garrett gang. She witnessed one of their attacks." Morrison set down his coffee cup and turned his full attention to Ayanna. "What did you see, miss?" The words came haltingly at first. She described the attack on her village, the burning teepees, the screams of her people. She told him about the leader with the scar across his left cheek and the way he had laughed while ordering his men to search for survivors. The sheriff's face grew increasingly grave as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "That matches what other witnesses described," he said finally. "The scar especially. That would be Jake Garrett himself." He looked directly at Ayanna. "Miss, I have to ask. Are you the survivor they've been tracking? The one they think escaped from the Indian village?" Ayanna nodded, unable to speak. Fear had closed her throat like a fist. "Then you're in more danger than I thought," Morrison said. "They don't leave witnesses alive, ever." He turned to Thomas. "Crawford, you need to understand what you're risking by hiding her here." "I understand perfectly," Thomas replied firmly. "And I'm not turning her out." The sheriff studied both of them for a moment. "Well then, we need a plan. They'll be here tomorrow, maybe the day after. When they come, they'll search every building." He paused, thinking. "There's an old root cellar behind your barn. Think it would hide one person?" Thomas nodded. "Built it myself when I first settled here. It's well concealed." "Good. When you see them coming up the valley, get her hidden there and act natural. Tell them you haven't seen any survivors and offer them food and coffee. Make them think you're just another rancher trying to stay on their good side." "What about after they leave?" Ayanna asked quietly. "They'll keep looking for me." "Maybe not," Morrison said. "If they think you died in the wilderness, they might give up the search. Winter's coming, and they'll want to head south before the snows trap them here." That night, after the sheriff had ridden away, Thomas showed Ayanna the hidden root cellar. It was small and dark, with barely enough room for one person to crouch inside. The entrance was concealed by a heavy wooden trapdoor covered with dirt and dried grass. "It's not comfortable," Thomas admitted. "But it should keep you safe until they move on." Ayanna knelt beside the opening, imagining herself trapped in that cramped space while murderers searched the ranch above. The thought made her stomach turn, but she knew it was her only chance. "Thomas," she said, using his first name for the first time, "why are you doing this? You could tell them I was never here. You could be safe." He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. 20 years ago, I was a different man. Angry, bitter, full of hate for anyone who didn't look like me. The blizzard that nearly killed me was just what I deserved for the things I'd done." He met her eyes. "Your grandfather didn't just save my life. He showed me that there was another way to live, with honor, with compassion." He helped her to her feet. "I owe your family a debt I can never fully repay." but I can start by making sure his granddaughter survives." As they walked back to the house under a sky full of stars, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced since the attack: hope. Tomorrow would bring danger unlike anything she had ever faced. But she was no longer facing it alone. The outlaws were coming, but they would find more than just another ranch to plunder. They would find two people willing to risk everything for what was right, bound together by courage, honor, and the memory of a Lakota elder who had believed that enemies could become family. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon the next day. Thomas spotted it first while checking his cattle near the pasture fence. 8 riders moving fast across the valley floor, their horses kicking up dirt with each thundering step. "Ayanna!" he called, running toward the house. "They're coming!" She was already watching from the kitchen window, her face pale but determined. Without a word, she gathered the few possessions she had brought and followed Thomas to the hidden cellar behind the barn. The wooden trap door creaked as he lifted it open. The space below was dark and cramped, barely large enough for a person to crouch inside. Ayanna looked down at her hiding place and took a deep breath. "Remember," Thomas said urgently, "no matter what you hear up here, don't come out until I give the all-clear signal. 3 knocks, then 2, then 3 again." She nodded and climbed down into the cellar. The last thing she saw before Thomas closed the trap door was his worried face outlined against the blue sky. Then everything went black. Above ground, Thomas quickly scattered dirt and dried grass over the hidden entrance until it looked like nothing more than ordinary earth. He checked his appearance, making sure he looked like a man going about his normal ranch work, then walked calmly back to the house. The riders arrived 15 minutes later in a cloud of dust and the sound of jangling spurs. Thomas stepped onto his front porch trying to appear relaxed, despite the fear gnawing at his stomach. These were dangerous men, and he was about to lie to their faces. The leader rode a black stallion and had a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw. This had to be Jake Garrett, the man Ayanna had described. His cold eyes swept over the ranch buildings looking for anything suspicious. "Afternoon," Garrett called out, though his tone held no friendliness. "You Thomas Crawford?" "That's right," Thomas replied. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Garrett dismounted and his men followed suit. They spread out around the yard, their hands resting on their gun handles. Thomas counted 8 of them, just as the sheriff had predicted. "We're tracking a survivor from an Indian village we raided a few days back," Garrett said, walking closer to the porch. "Young squaw, probably injured and hungry. You seen anything like that?" Thomas shook his head. "No, sir. I haven't seen any Indians around here for weeks, just me and my cattle." One of the outlaws, a thin man with yellowed teeth, spat in the dirt. "Boss, he's lying. Look how nervous he is." Thomas forced himself to remain calm, though his heart was pounding. "Well, I'll admit you boys make me a bit nervous. Don't get many visitors out here, especially ones carrying so much iron." Garrett studied Thomas's face for signs of deception. "Mind if we look around, just to be sure?" "Help yourselves," Thomas said, gesturing toward his buildings. "Though I'd appreciate it if you didn't spook my animals." The outlaws split up, searching the barn, the chicken coop, and the small storage shed. Thomas watched them tear through his property, overturning hay bales and checking every corner where a person might hide. Down in the root cellar, Ayanna heard the heavy footsteps above her head. Boot heels scraped against the ground just inches from her hiding place. She pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle her breathing and tried not to think about what would happen if they found her. "Nothing in the barn, boss," one of the men reported. "Check the house," Garrett ordered. Thomas's stomach clenched, but he maintained his calm expression. "You're welcome to look inside, but I warn you, I'm not much of a housekeeper since my wife passed." 4 of the outlaws tramped through his home, searching under beds, inside closets, and behind furniture. They found the women's clothes Thomas had given to Ayanna, and his blood turned cold. "Boss!" the yellow-toothed outlaw called from the bedroom. "Found women's clothes here. Fresh ones, too." Garrett's scar twisted as he smiled. "Well now, Mr. Crawford, you said you lived alone." Thomas had prepared for this question. "Those belong to my wife. She died of fever last spring, but I haven't had the heart to get rid of her things yet." "Show me her grave," Garrett demanded. Thomas led them to a small cemetery plot behind the house, where a wooden cross marked his wife's resting place. The grave was real. Martha Crawford had indeed died the previous spring, but Thomas's mind raced as he realized how close he had come to being caught in his lie. Garrett knelt beside the grave, studying the weathered wood and settled earth. After a long moment, he stood up and brushed dirt from his knees. "Looks old enough," he admitted, "but I still think you're hiding something." The yellow-toothed outlaw pointed toward the area behind the barn. "What about over there, boss? Looks like the ground's been disturbed." Thomas's blood froze. They were pointing directly at the hidden cellar where Ayanna was concealed. "Just where I buried a dead calf last week," Thomas said quickly. "Lost one to a rattlesnake bite." Garrett walked over to examine the spot. He stood directly above Ayanna's hiding place, so close that she could hear his breathing through the thin layer of earth above her head. "Dig it up," he ordered his men. Thomas knew he had seconds to act. If they dug even a few inches, they would find the trap door and discover Ayanna. He had to create a distraction, something that would make them leave without completing their search. "Before you boys start digging up dead animals," Thomas said loudly, "maybe you'd like some coffee and food for the road. It's a long ride to the next ranch." Garrett turned away from the burial spot. "We don't have time for—" His words were cut off by the sound of approaching horses. Sheriff Morrison appeared at the head of the valley with 6 armed deputies, riding hard toward the ranch. "Lawmen!" one of the outlaws shouted. Garrett cursed and ran for his horse. "Mount up! We're leaving now!" The gang scrambled onto their horses and spurred them toward the back hills, abandoning their search as they fled from the approaching law enforcement. Dust clouds marked their retreat as they disappeared into the broken country beyond Thomas's property. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies thundered into the ranch yard just as the outlaws vanished from sight. "Which way did they go?" Morrison called out. Thomas pointed toward the hills. "That direction, Sheriff. Moving fast. We'll try to track them, but they know this country better than we do." Morrison looked around the ranch. "Everyone all right here?" Thomas nodded, though his knees felt weak with relief. They searched the place pretty thoroughly but didn't find what they were looking for. After the lawmen rode away in pursuit of the gang, Thomas waited another hour to make sure no one was watching. Then he walked to the hidden cellar and knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice, then 3 times again. The trapdoor opened, and Ayanna emerged blinking into the sunlight. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was alive and unharmed. "They're gone?" she asked. "They're gone," Thomas confirmed, helping her to her feet. "And Sheriff Morrison is chasing them south. I don't think they'll be back this way." That evening, as they sat by the fireplace sharing a quiet dinner, Ayanna spoke the words that had been in her heart since the moment Thomas first opened his door. "You saved my life," she said simply. "How can I ever repay such a debt?" Thomas smiled, remembering his conversation with her grandfather so many years before. "The same way your grandfather repaid his debts, by living with honor and helping others when they need it most." A week later, when Sheriff Morrison returned with news that the Garrett gang had fled the territory, Ayanna faced her next decision. Thomas offered to let her stay on the ranch as long as she wanted, but they both knew she needed to find others of her people who had survived. She left on a crisp October morning, carrying supplies and warm clothes that Thomas had provided. But she also carried something more valuable, the knowledge that kindness could bridge any divide between strangers, and that courage came not from the absence of fear, but from doing what was right despite that fear. Years later, when Ayanna had found her surviving relatives and helped build a new community, she would tell her children about the white rancher who risked everything to protect a trembling Lakota girl. And Thomas Crawford, growing older alone on his ranch, would sometimes see smoke rising from the distant mountains and smile, knowing that somewhere out there, Running Bear's granddaughter was living the honorable life her grandfather had taught them both to value. The debt between their families was finally paid, not in gold or goods, but in the coin that mattered most, human compassion offered freely in the darkest of times.